Book Stew viewers and listeners. Today I'm going to introduce you to an author who comes to us and came to her book in kind of a roundabout way. The book we're going to be talking about is by Sandra Freels, and the title is Anneke Jans in the New World. And the title is very descriptive. It's a story that goes back to the mid-1600s, early 1600s, in what we think of as the modern-day Manhattan, New Amsterdam, and the area that surrounds it. So welcome, Sandra, to Book Stew.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how this book evolved and how you evolved to write it.
Okay. I am a retired professor of Russian and an amateur genealogist. And in 2020, just about the time I had to stop interacting with living people, I came across Anneke Jans. I believe she is my 11G grandmother.
Ah.
But whether she is or not, I also found that the council records of New Amsterdam are available in English translation on the website of the New Netherland Institute. So during the pandemic, I spent hours and hours and hours scouring through these records looking for references to the many, about 20 people I believe I'm descended from. And at the end of that time, I felt like I had a real understanding of what their community must have been like. I selected Anneke as my protagonist because her own life had so many amazing twists and turns. So that's how I ended up writing about New Netherland.
So how did you yourself, before you started your research, what did you know about your own background from your parents, your family?
Oh, nothing about Dutch at all. I mean, like most Americans, I know at most my grandparents or my great grandparents. So it was a real surprise to me to discover this Dutch connection. And then having discovered it, to find that there were so many materials available. Usually you feel like you're lucky if you can establish a name or a date. And here was a complete picture of a community that, frankly, I never knew existed. I didn't pay much attention to American colonial history when I was studying Russian.
So it's just amazing how it came about. Did you have any help? Was this all done on your own? Did you use like 23andMe, or I can't remember any of the sites that people go to all the time when they're doing genealogical research? How
Um,
did you work your way to this group that had Dutch documentation?
Initially through
Yeah,
Ancestry.com.
that's it.
And then when I find someone I believe fits in the family tree, I then do a Google search to see what else I can find out, either about the person or the place they lived or the time they lived. And when I did my first Google search for Anneke Jans, I just got page after page after page after page. So there was a huge amount to look at there.
So you kind of lucked out, and
I did,
perhaps
yes.
the main reason is because you mention at the end of the book she had 10 children from two different husbands, and there was a big brouhaha after she died about her estate
That's
that
right.
sounded like, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce in Bleak House kind of. So
Uh-huh.
that probably brought a lot of information into light that may not have been if it was like a less contentious will.
That's true. Um, Decades after Anneke's death, it had nothing to do with her as a person. There was this ongoing suit by her heirs against Trinity Episcopalian Church regarding property that her descendants had sold to the church. That's a long, involved story, but that did cause more attention to be paid to her. And what I did not mention in the epilogue is one of the things that came out of this lawsuit was a genuine scam where descendants of Anneke Jans, this is early 20th century, were invited to pay a small fee, I don't remember, something like $25 a year, to join the Descendants of Anneke Jans Association with the assurance that in time they would come in for a portion of the vast amount of money set aside in Europe for her descendants because she was said to be an illegitimate granddaughter of William I. This is total nonsense.
Oh,
But it made me even more determined to try to figure out what she might have been like as a real person before any of these.
wow. I mean, I know that scammers are inventive, but that's probably
Yeah,
one of the most inventive stories I've ever heard. But
inventive, and they've been with us a long time too.
can you tell us what you think? I mean, it seems to me that she and her husband just got on a boat, came to the New World. What was brewing at home in Amsterdam and where she was that really caused them to take such a bold step? I mean, it wasn't like they were getting emails saying, okay, the boat landed okay. I mean, they were basically, I think, going on some hearsay that might have gotten back to them, but the communication obviously was took years. So how do you think that came about, her deciding to leave?
I am fairly sure that they were economic refugees. I believe that her family and her first husband immigrated from Norwegian territory to Amsterdam, almost certainly for economic reasons. Um, Her husband was almost certainly a seaman, and a great many of the Norwegian seamen ended up in the employ of the Dutch.
Hmm.
So that's how that connection would have been made. Why he would have been hired to manage a farm in the New World is anybody's guess. So I decided to make it part of the pressure of her manipulative mother who got him that job. But
Ah.
honestly, I have no idea. It would have been for economic reasons. I'm fairly sure about that. And I'm fairly sure that in getting on that boat, they had a sense of cutting all their ties with the old world. Some people did go back, but it was not something you could do once a week. They were leaving as far as they knew forever, and as far as they knew, cutting all ties with everything they had ever known or loved.
So different than now. I mean, now you can leave and try to come here, which isn't likely anyone's going to be able to do that these days. But you don't have to cut ties. You can come, check it out, go back home. I mean, it's the ease of the safety of getting back and forth is so different. So, one thing that was very pleasing, I thought, about the narrative was her relationship with the local Indians. And the word that was used was Wilden. And you had an explanation for that, which you basically said that Wilden was the word, I may not be pronouncing it right, for Indians in general, but there was a negative connotation of savages, and there was a positive connotation of Wilden as being people native to this place. So her positive interactions with the Indian neighbors who were basically being stripped of their land, I thought was very encouraging to see her basic humanity.
Good. Um, that section was very important to me. Um, Annika's interactions with her two Mohican neighbors are totally fictional. She did not keep a diary, but we know from archaeological records that some similar interactions did take place. And we know that her oldest daughter did speak one of the dialects well enough to later on in life be an interpreter. So, in describing the intercultural exchanges of the Dutch settlers on the outskirts of the wilderness who had no idea where they were, and the sister and brother, Wilania and Kitpool, who are curious about the newcomers. Um, that part means a lot to me because, as we know, relations deteriorated
And that
further on in history.
and
Yeah.
that was interesting too because Peter Stuyvesant is a character in the book, and
Uh-huh.
I'd say that having grown up in New York, everything is Stuyvesant in New York. I mean, it's just
Right.
like a
Uh-huh.
Stuyvesant world. And I know
Right.
now you can go on a tour of Dutch areas, formerly Dutch areas in Lower Manhattan, and
Uh-huh.
find, archaeological details, churches, whatever. Now, your view of Stuyvesant was not that positive. Do you want to talk about him a little bit?
I can talk about him a little bit. I may have done him a disservice. Um, I was, again, this book is completely a work of imagination. The basic dates and facts of what happened are documented, but the personalities, the relationships, everything else is invented. Um, I very much wanted to present a history not from the point of view of the great man who made everything happen, but of the housewife who witnessed what happened, who contributed to what happened, and who was affected by what happened. So I'm not sure it's my view of him that's negative, but she had a kind of cantankerous view of him as standing in her way, as being someone who hindered her in things she needed to do to protect herself and her family.
Well, he certainly seemed like the type to like push his power around and to
Uh-huh.
intimidate people. But that I guess that's why everything is named after him. But let's talk a little bit about the structure because her husband was her second husband who was a dominie. Is that the way you say it?
Yes.
So it
Hmm.
was like, give unto Caesar what is Caesar. So there were the Caesars, and then there were the church people.
Right.
Can you talk about
That's
that a little bit and the official roles that were assigned?
um, Anneka's second husband was the minister of the church on Manhattan at that time. Um, and an interesting thing about the Dutch colony is that even though the Dutch Reformed Church was the only one that was permitted to openly practice, they were tolerant of other denominations. And that's one of the reasons the Dutch colony became so remarkably diverse. There were certainly people of other religious dominations there who were not being persecuted as they might have been in other parts of Europe or other parts of the North American colonies. But in the structure of the place, the employees of the Dutch West India Company, and that would have been Stuyvesant, um, were in control. He was the director of the colony. And even though people could send complaints back to the old world, it took forever for them to get there and another forever for any reply to come back. So he had, I don't want to say unlimited power, but he was very much in control of the colony. The minister, Anneka's second husband, was also an employee of the colony. He was hired by them to minister to the colonists. And there is tension between the director, Stuyvesant, thinking he is the most important person placed over all of them by God, And the messenger saying, "No, you are not placed over me. I am equally important. I answer only to the parent church back in the old world." So that's a lot of the source of that conflict. Did I answer it?
Yeah, you did. And I guess what's popped up in the United States recently is a little bit of that conflict between
It
uh,
hasn't gone away.
church and state. And who would
Yeah.
expect it? That hasn't happened in like 400 years. So I'm going to ask you to do a little reading. I was thinking initially about having you read the author's note, but I think we've talked a lot about the basis of the book. So instead, I'm going to ask you to read a passage that I just thought was absolutely delightful and kind of a foreshadowing of what life is like now for us. And you'll just have to tell us who the characters are, and then if you could read those 2 pages, that would be great.
Um, what I'm going to read is a passage toward the end of the novel. Anneka's second husband has died, and she has left Manhattan to go back to the place that we now know as Albany, New York. Then it was called Beverwijk. She's living alone, and her younger sister, Marietje, comes to visit. And Marietje has married well, she's married wealth, she's always been livelier, more outgoing, and she brings with her this wonderful invention. Now, I have to say that this truly is invented, but this is about the time these things were becoming popular in Europe and arriving in the New World. So here is what happens when Kid Sister comes to visit. When Annika awakened shortly after dawn the following morning, after Marich's arrival, she found her indefatigable sister out in the chicken coop collecting eggs. "Oh, good, you're up," Maricha said. "I have the most amazing thing to show you." Back at the house, Maricha plunged once more into her trunk and emerged with an iron contraption that consisted of a perforated barrel turned by a handle suspended over a shallow tray. "This was Hobart's wedding present to me," she said. "How romantic," Annika said. "Yeah, I was furious until I found the diamond brooch hidden inside, but Hobart was right. This thing is more valuable than diamonds. It entertains me, provides me with pocket money, and helps me keep the peace with my stepdaughters. It's called a roaster. And this is what we're going to roast," she said, producing a small bag of pale green beans. "They look like gray peas," Annika said. "Wouldn't it be better to boil them?" "These are the pits of coffee cherries, and they come from Java. Look, I'm going to put some coals in the bottom tray of my roaster. Put the coffee seeds into the barrel and turn the handle until the seeds turn brown. And while I'm doing that, I want you to boil a pan of spring water until it's reduced by about a half." About an hour later, Maricha poured her roasted pits into Annika's mortar and ground them into a coarse powder. "Now," she said, "we'll add the coffee powder and a little sugar to your spring water and let it boil gently for another 45 minutes until it turns into coffee wine." "I can certainly see how anything that complicated keeps you occupied. But what does it have to do with your stepdaughters?" Annika asked. "Men pay good money for coffee wine," Maricha answered. "Other women serve beer and wine and spirits in their front parlors, and I've taken to selling coffee." "How can you manage to make coffee every day when it takes so long to prepare?" Annika asked. "Annika," Maricha said gently, "we have servants. I have a scullery maid who roasts the pits and prepares the beverage. She keeps a pot of it warm by the fire and serves it to our paying guests. The leading men of the community come to my house for conversation and coffee, and many of the younger ones as well. And on the afternoons when we serve coffee, my stepdaughters delight in playing hostess. For them, it's an opportunity to dress in ribbons and lace and to meet handsome young men they would normally see only at church. Stuyvesant's nephews are regulars, and one of our most frequent guests is your grandson, Hansel. So,
So
totally
how
invented. That is how coffee
well
was made in the
but
17th century.
you said it was a fact that at the time there were a coffee roasting had been brought to the colonies. How so you're researching genealogy and yet you come across a coffee roaster and thought to put it in, which I thought was a great part. How how did an invention enter into your research, an invention like that?
I was trying to think, no, genealogy for me is more than names and dates. I really want to try to imagine how people lived. And usually the most I can come up with is names and dates, which is disappointing. Um, and thinking about these sisters living uh, at this pivotal time in history, just at the very edge of our new modern world. Um, I knew coffee shops were opening in the old world in England and in Amsterdam, and I was wondering, well, I wonder how it came to the New World. And I found a picture of a coffee roaster, and that's what I was describing here. I gave it to Maricha and let her make coffee, and it really was that laborious. Probably tasted awful, but that was kind of how it got started here.
Yeah, you didn't say anything about sugar and cream, so I don't know. And just the fact that it's called coffee wine, it makes sense because of the intricate process of
And it's
making it and brewing
intoxicating.
it. And I
Uh-huh.
also noticed there was no mention of tea, which of course the English must have been more addicted to than the Dutch were, because of course we know of all the machinations with tea in Boston that followed that. Was there
Right.
anything else in your research that you found to be really surprising, like something that made you just say, "Oh, I never could have imagined that"?
So many things. Uh, One of my first responses, and probably one of yours, was how in the world did women survive 10 pregnancies? And how in the world did they survive losing so many children as almost every family did? Uh, I wondered about how women gave birth. And, it was not in the hospital with stirrups. There was a birthing chair so they could sit upright. And I described a 17th century birthing chair being brought to Anneke when she gave birth in the wilderness. That was a surprising and interesting thing. Um, and I wanted to throw in as many of these, I don't want to say off-putting ideas, but things that throw you off balance. That was one of the reasons I used so many foreign terms. I hope not excessively. But I never wanted the reader to think, oh, this is just like, you know, back home. This is exactly what I would have done or how I would have thought. This was a very different world. And I wanted to convey some of the strangeness of that while still having the reader empathize with the characters, especially Annika and what they're going through, and wondering about the decisions they make. They don't know if they're right or wrong. They don't know what the consequences are going to be. So I was
You
trying to get all of that into a few pages.
well, you also did mention people who were enslaved. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yes. At the period of time I'm writing about, um, there were enslaved Africans in New Amsterdam. Annika and her family arrived in 1630, And the first enslaved Africans were brought there in 1627. They were small in number. We know of 11. They were probably originally more. And they almost certainly were captured from a Portuguese ship. They probably had already been baptized um, as Roman Catholics. This
Hmm.
is speculation. They didn't keep diaries either, but this seems most likely. At this very early period, and this is fascinating to me about the early New World, there was a lot of confusion about degrees of servitude. There were indentured servants. There were, I think I gave an example of one family who sold their 8-year-old daughter into a 3-year position of indenture. And these early Africans were at that time not considered servants for life. In 1944, during a conflict with Indians, they petitioned the city council for their freedom, and it was granted in part. They were granted half freedom. They and their wives would be freed. They would be given their own parcels of land so they could support themselves, but their children were to remain property of the West India Company. So a lot of confusion. That was not the only instance when enslaved Africans petitioned for freedom and had their petitions granted. As the century wore on, the Dutch West India Company began trading in slaves. And that's when we see the institution harden and become something. We see the slaves become commodified, and the entire system becomes much more rigid. So that was also very interesting to me about this strange liminal world that Anneke is inhabiting.
And the acceptance of the Dutch West India Company as just the be all and end all because, they paid for ships to come here, they initiated trade all over the world. It's I think it's easier now within the context of our modern world to see that they did not represent just the positive of commerce and the exploration of the world, but also the extent of colonialism and the impact on the whole world. So I think the book is really, it was really educational about the Dutch West Indian Company because, I can remember learning world history and learning about the settlement of the United States, and the Dutch West Indian Company are just like, we're always represented as these very brave men with the foresight to blah, 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 blah. And you give, I think, a much more balanced impression of them in the book.
Hope so.
All right, well, we're out of time, so I'm sorry that we're out of time so early, but I would like to recommend your book not only for the subject matter, the focus on a woman as your primary character, but also the balance that you have between what you learned and the facts and what you've made up. I think a lot of historical fiction I find just goes way too much in the way of making up a good story. And I'm sure there's, they stick a little bit of history in there, like they'll say, well, in 1630, blah, blah, blah. But I think this book was unique to me in historical fiction for being so well balanced between presenting facts and not making up too much about the characters, and I think that does make it unique to me. And I want to thank you for writing it and sharing it with me and joining me on Book Stew.
Yeah, Eileen, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks. And readers and listeners, you can find this book very easily. Remember, it's Anneke Jans in the New World by Sandra Freels. And have a good night.